separate. Even if I ran away, your love never fades. I know I still make mistakes, but you have new mercies for me every day. 'Cause your love never fades. You stay the same through the ages. Your love never changes. There may be pain in the night, but joy comes in the morning. And when the oceans rage, I don't have to be afraid, because I know that you love me. Your love never fades. Your love so high in love, so wide in love, so deep in love, so long. Death, no life, no angels, no powers, prayers that means nothing in the future. I know that no enemy created, they can't separate. I know that death, no life, no angels, no powers, prayers that means nothing in the future. I know that no enemy created, they can't separate. So high in love, so wide in love, so deep in love, so long in love, so high in love, so wide in love, so deep in love, so long in love, so high in love, so wide in love, so deep in love, so long in love, so high in love, so wide in love, so deep in love, so long. Wherever you lead me, I'm gonna follow. I'm trusting you, God, you are good. Life will be crazy, wild and amazing. I'm trusting you, God, you are good. Wherever you lead me, I'm gonna follow. I'm trusting you, God, you are good. Life will get crazy, wild and amazing. I'm trusting you, God, you are good. I wanna live each day like anything can happen. Can't hardly wait to see what's next. I wanna face this world with wonder and excitement. Face every challenge every day. Wherever you lead me, I'm gonna follow. I'm trusting you, God, you are good. Life will get crazy, wild and amazing, but I'm trusting you, God, you are good. Walk through the valley, climb mountains high. Wherever we go, Lord, you are good. Can't hold me back now, I'm gonna fly. Wherever we go, Lord, you are. Walk through the valley, climb mountains high. Wherever we go, Lord, you are good. You can't hold me back now, I'm gonna fly. Wherever we go, Lord, you are. I wanna live each day that anything can happen. Can't hardly wait to see what's next. I wanna face this world with wonder and excitement. Face every challenge every day. Wherever you lead me, I'm gonna follow. I'm trusting you, God, you are good. Well, I will get crazy, wild and amazing. I'm trusting you, God, you are good. Wherever you lead me, I'm gonna follow. I'm trusting you, God, you are good. This life can be crazy, wild and amazing, but I'm trusting you, God, you are good. I'm trusting you, God, you are good. Yes, I'm trusting you, God, you are good.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Christopher, and I am from Zimbabwe, and I am 38 years old. This is all relevant to my story. Just to give you a little bit of background so you understand the impact of my testimony. When I graduated from my bachelor's, the plan was that I'll immediately get into my master's and then my PhD, and my life plan was that by the time I turned 30, I'll have my doctorate. But it didn't go as planned. And if any of you know anything about Zimbabwe, for the past 15, 20 years, it's been going in an economic meltdown and things have been bad. And so since 2004, I've been applying for places to do a master's, and every year since then, I'll get a place. But the issue was money. I couldn't get, there was no way my family was able to do that. My father got disabled in 1986, my mother was a civil servant, they had 5 kids to take care of, so I knew that there wasn't any way that my family could afford to send me for my master's. So it was up to me or up to God. So since 2004, applying for places, I'll get places, and then I'll be applying for scholarship after scholarship, scholarship after scholarship, and nothing panned out. I worked for a while, and then in 2016, I had to be let go because my organization that I was working for didn't have any funding anymore. And at 37, I had to move back into my parents' house. I mean, that can be a bit embarrassing. At 37, you're expected to be, well, at least in my culture, at 37, you're supposed to be helping your parents and your siblings as well to come up. But I was the one who was moving back home. And then last year, the beginning of last year, 2018, we had a women's conference at our church. And the lady who was speaking spoke from Isaiah 55, verse 1. Is anyone thirsty? Come and drink. Even if you have no money, come, take your choice of wine or milk, it's all free. Now, I like to take the word of God literally. He said, even if you don't have money, come and take it all, it's all free. And that's the part that I grasped. And I went to God and I said, you know what, Lord? I really don't care where the money is going to come from, but this year, it's time I started my master's. You know, I'm not at a place where I'm supposed to be. So, your word says, even if I do not have money, come and get it. And so this year I'm going to school. You're either going to provide me with a scholarship or you're going to give me a job that's going to pay me a bucket load of money so I can pay for myself and go to school. I don't care how you're going to do it. I'm going to school this year. And that was my actual conversation with God. So, and then I said, you know what? You own all silver and gold are yours. And you own a cattle upon 1,000 hills. So even if you're broke, you'll still sell a couple of those cattle and send me to school. So I applied, and guess what? I got a scholarship last year to come to Maastricht University to study for my master's in public policy and human development. And it's been an amazing year. I mean, my family had literally written me off like, you know what? We have given up on you. But the one thing that I knew was my hope was in the Lord. In our culture, in the Zimbabwean African context, we have witch doctors, we have spirit mediums, and sometimes people have to consult those for, you know. But my family would say, we need to go to a witch doctor. You know, you're so unlucky. We need you to be washed off this unluckiness of you. And I was like, no, I'm not going there. And they knew that I wouldn't. And I suspect some of them went behind my back, but that's another story. And my mom was like, you know what? You cannot be helped. We're tired. We're not going to do it. But I just knew that if I held on, one day the Lord will come through for me. And so when I stand here and I look at my life, all I see is the glory of the Lord. That when everybody else had written me off and said, you know what, you can't be helped, we can't do anything for you, you're not going to go anywhere, God turned it around and He brought me to this place. I mean, I don't know where I'm going to next. I honestly, seriously don't know. But the one thing that I know is His word has assured me that He who began a new thing in me will surely see it to completion. And I'm excited about where the Lord is going to take me. I've been through so many storms, through many deserts, through many mountains, but I know this one thing. God is in control of my life. And all I just want to do is just continuously give Him all the glory that He deserves, give Him all the honor that He deserves, because I know that when you see me, when people look at me, it's not my abilities, it's not my doing, it's not anything that I have done, but I'm just totally dependent on His grace and dependent on His love. So I'm going to sing with this guy a song. It may be familiar to some of you, so you can join us.
You are Alpha and Omega. We worship you, our Lord. You are worthy to be praised. You are Alpha and Omega. We worship you, our Lord. You are worthy to be praised. We give you all the glory. We give you all the glory. We worship you, oh Lord. You are worthy to be praised. We give you all the glory. We give you all the glory. We worship you, oh Lord. You are worthy to be praised. Alpha and Omega. You are Alpha and Omega. We worship you, oh Lord. You are worthy to be praised. Alpha and Omega. You are Alpha and Omega. We worship you, oh Lord. You are worthy to be praised. We give you all the glory. We give you all the glory. We worship you, oh Lord. You are worthy to be praised. We give you all the glory. We give you all the glory. We worship you, oh Lord. You are worthy to be praised. Take all the glory, Almighty God. Take all the glory, Lord. Take all the glory, Almighty God. Take all
because you are Lord. You're in control, so Spirit of the living God. All glory and honor to you, now and forevermore. Amen.
But the kids are with us today, so Pastor Matthew and I have geared our sermon toward the children. So here's what we'd like the parents to do. Would you please bring your kids up to some of the front rows or to sit on the carpet? And parents can then help translate. And with each sermon point, we have an activity for the kids to do. So the kids can come move up to the front so that they can more easily participate in the activities.
So welcome aboard. We have been looking at this faith training friendship between the Apostle Paul and his protege Timothy, seeing how Paul wanted to inspire Timothy to continue, believing that Timothy was already filled with the Spirit or inspirited. Part of inspiration includes warnings, and the Holy Spirit does warn us. And so today we're looking at some of those warnings. To say at the very beginning, this is not a fear tactic, but we should take warnings about shipwrecking our faith seriously. So Paul, as he wrote to Timothy, he referred to some people and he said that they had shipwrecked their faith. So sort of like the ship was their faith and how they're acting. And then there are these waves of trials and tribulations and these various things that we'll look at, sandbars, and those things could wreck our faith. So, we're going to look at what are some of those things that could take us off course or get our faith wrecked because we want to avoid that. Now, to start with, we're going to have a story based on Paul's life.
We need a bunch of actors for the story.
So, who wants to help acting out a story?
Wait, no, I can go in there. No, we're putting Uni.
I need a couple of light people to be in the boat. Uni, do you want to get in the boat? Estelle, do you want to get in the boat? I think we can fit 2 people in the boat. We have lots of other parts to play too.
She gets that right. Why would Paul specifically use the picture of a shipwreck with having to do with our faith? And we think that a very good likelihood is because Paul had himself been through several shipwrecks. He knew what it was like to literally be in a shipwreck. And for those of you that studied through the book of Acts with us, you read about one of those shipwrecks. And we're going to tell that story a little bit more because that's the one that we know most about how it went. So Paul was being taken on a ship to Rome, and he was a prisoner on that ship, and there were 276 people on that ship. So consider everyone in here times about 3 or so, or I don't know, all of them on one ship.
So now we need a few more sailors to come stand behind the ship and help us get ready to deal with some cargo. So stand behind the ship and get ready. You have an important action to do in a few minutes.
And then do we also have a split up for soldiers?
We need some strong soldiers. IJ, can you be a strong soldier?
Yeah.
You stand here and guard the ship.
So we have the prisoners, the sailors, and the soldiers. And they started out from their island, and weather looked good, but Paul had warned them that the Holy Spirit had warned him, we shouldn't leave yet, there's going to be a problem. But they thought, no, the weather's good. So they start sailing, smooth sailing, going along.
I need a few more people to come make some waves. Can you make some waves? I need some people to wave the fabric and make some waves.
As they're sailing, a storm starts to come up. And not just a little storm, a big storm is happening. And it's not just going on for a few minutes, not just a few hours. It's going on for days and days. And as it's going, and it's this huge storm, even the sailors are thinking we're probably not going to make it out alive, and they're so nervous they can't even eat, which is a really bad form of nervousness.
Can you scream in terror? More terror!
So they're afraid for their lives, and they're hungry,
and they're having to do all this work. They barely slept because the boat is turning back and forth as it's going. But then Paul calls all of the sailors together, and he says to them, last night an angel showed up to me and told me we're all going to live through this storm, but the ship is going to get wrecked. They probably were telling stop it so many times, because if you've ever been in a closed quarters, think 276 people on a ship, 14 days in a storm, not eating enough, not sleeping enough. This is going to be bad attitudes all around. But Paul's trying to say, okay, we're going to make it and take something to eat. So finally they eat.
Can you pretend to eat? Eat some bread?
And the sailors are getting the feeling, they just have this natural feeling that they're getting close to the shore. And so they start measuring the depths, and it's going very quickly, and they're afraid that they're going to get shipwrecked because they apparently forgot that Paul told them the ship was going to get wrecked. At first, the sailors think, well, we don't want to be on this but it wrecks, so we're going to all take the lifeboats and we're going to go ourselves. But as the sailors are getting the lifeboats, Paul says to the soldiers, no. You need to stop them from doing that, because if the sailors leave, we're all going to die. God only agreed that we would live if the sailors stay on this boat. You have to stop them. So soldiers have to stop the sailors from jumping ship.
Stay on the boat. Stay on the boat. Stay on the boat.
And as they're stopping them, then the sailors decide, okay, we'll stay, but we have to make the ship lighter. That way we're not as heavy, we won't run into things. So they decide to throw...
They're going to throw all the cargo overboard. Can you throw all the boxes? Take all these boxes and throw them overboard. Throw them out of the ship, all the cargo.
They're throwing the taco shells overboard. They're throwing the sushi rice overboard, the cornettos, the Kleenexes, the bug blockers, the plates, everything. All that food that they just downed, they're throwing it out. And they cut off the anchors, and they let themselves be blown by the wind. And then finally, they see land, they see a shore, and they try to aim for the shore, but they hit a sandbar before they get there, and so it's stuck there, and the water keeps pushing against it, and it's breaking the ship apart. And the soldiers are afraid that all their prisoners are going to run away. And especially at that time, if you're a Roman soldier and your prisoner gets away, then you could be held liable. You could be killed for that. So they think, we're just going to kill all the prisoners now so none of them escape. But thankfully, the leader of the soldiers says, no, don't kill him because I don't want Paul to die. And Paul says, no, we're all going to make it. No one's going to run away. The people that can swim, you jump overboard and start swimming.
Quick, jump overboard and swim to the shore.
If you know how to swim.
Overboard.
And for those that didn't know how to swim, he said, hold on to the cargo that's out there, hold on to the little pieces of wood, all of those things, and wave to shore holding on to something that floats. Don't hold on to the anchor, because that's not going to make you get there.
Shore, quick.
Mais hay mucho acá.
Swim.
Now our ship is a mess.
All 276 people made it to shore alive. So Paul had lived through this, and likely at least 3 other times. Talk about some nerds. And so Paul knew that there were various things that could sink a ship. And he tells Timothy, you need to be careful of people who have shipwrecked their faith and don't shipwreck your faith as well. So we're going to look at 6 different risks. How many of you can put up 6 on your hands? Seth? How many do it? Oh, 3 and 3, 5 and 1. Do you have anyone who does it by 4 and 2? Who does it by 6 and 9? No one has, okay. So we're going to look at 6 of them. The first one is lies. Or no, first you're going to share about settings. Share the settings, please.
So Paul probably wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy to Timothy in the 60s AD while he was imprisoned in Rome, and this would have been shortly before the Romans beheaded him. So Paul was in Rome, and there were Christians in Rome, in modern-day Italy, and they were facing the struggle of persecution. And Paul was writing to Timothy, who was in Ephesus, which is in modern-day Turkey, and they were facing a different struggle, which was a lot of false teaching that was leading them away from following Jesus. So Paul is sending Timothy pastoral advice for leading the churches in Ephesus, and he calls Timothy to come see him, knowing that his life was almost over. And since Timothy was one of his best friends and was like his son, he wanted Timothy to come to him. And as we heard in the story, Paul's actual experience with shipwrecks makes a lot of sense for why he would use shipwrecking your faith as an analogy. Now, Matt and I have just finished teaching a year-long course that we call DRX about biblical interpretation and preaching. And one of the sources that we studied was by Dr. Craig Keener, who writes a lot of biblical background information. So a lot of my cultural notes come from his work on biblical background. And his Acts commentary, which if you stack up all the volumes, is this tall. It's just stacks of books, only on the book of Acts. So lots of background information and interpretation. So he says that there are over 1,000 shipwreck sites known from Bible times in the Mediterranean. And shipwrecks were incredibly common, and they were a common literary theme. So Luke, who was Paul's friend, who wrote the book of Acts, was actually with Paul during this shipwreck. So even though Paul had been shipwrecked 3 other times, this is the one that Luke writes about, and he writes about it in great detail because he was there, so he's got his own eyewitness account of it. And Luke's details about the sailing and the geography and the culture all check out with other sources of the time, so we know that his report of the shipwreck is accurate. And in the literature of the time, and we see Luke using some of these literary conventions, someone who survived a terrible ordeal was usually someone who was blessed by the gods or someone who was proved to be morally a good person. So when Luke tells about Paul surviving the shipwreck and Paul then surviving a snake bite, what Luke is doing is saying that Paul is morally good, that his mission is approved by God, and that God was with Paul and God was saving him so that he could get out of Rome. So we know that God was honoring Paul's character and his work and his mission. And so these warnings to Timothy can be valuable for us to be aware of today so that we can learn from wisdom and avoid dangers to our faith that could pull us away from Jesus. Now, what are some things that cause actual shipwrecks today? Can you guys think of anything?
Big rocks.
Big rocks?
Yeah.
What causes shipwrecks? What might make a ship sink?
A storm.
A storm? Too many people?
Big wave.
Strong waves.
Strong waves, yes, definitely. What about icebergs?
Yeah.
Not in the Mediterranean, but in other oceans. Yes. What about a giant whale? Or a sea monster? Or a sandbar? Or a coral reef? Or a torpedo?
I know something.
So there are a lot of things that can cause a real ship to sink, and we're going to look at 6 things that can cause our faith to sink. And the first one is lies.
The first one is lies. So Paul writes to Timothy and says, beware of people who have this false teaching, because they've destroyed their conscience. Now that word conscience, everyone knows that they have a conscience, right? And through 1st and 2nd Timothy, Paul writes about conscience a lot, and it's an important thing. He says to have a good conscience. He's giving these commands so that Timothy would keep a good conscience, but he writes about these other people that who have seared their consciences, who've pushed away their conscience and said, even though I know what I should follow, I won't. And so these people that have walked away from their conscience are teaching things that are ignorant, that he calls idle chatter, things that are false knowledge. He says some people turn away from those and they've deadened their conscience. So this is a warning from the Holy Spirit not to deaden your conscience. And these people weren't just listening to that teaching, but then were passing it along to others and teaching others false things. And we don't know what all of that was, but some of that teaching, he says, led to foolishness and to godless behavior, and to some people turning away from their faith. And he said that those people were speaking bad things about God. He says they're speaking blasphemies, and that's what blasphemy means in short. So as they're doing all these things, they're claiming that the resurrection had occurred. We're told that later. And not that the resurrection of Jesus had occurred, because we believe that, right? But they were using the idea of the belief in the resurrection already happening to say that people now no longer had to follow what was godly ways, it seemed. And that's why they're turning to godlessness. And so as they were doing that, he says they've left the path of truth. Now, one of the things when you're steering a ship that can be very dangerous is if you leave the right path, correct? So you need to have a map that tells you the way to go. Sometimes people know those maps from the stars, they have no in their head. So we have some maps for you all to work with. You want to make sure that you're following the right map. And that's the same with teaching. If teaching that you're receiving and giving is a good map, then people can get to their course right. But if it's a bad map, then it's going to lead you towards danger, or at least not towards where you want to get to. So these maps have 3 different start points and 3 different endings. And 2 of those endings are the wrong island. But one of them is the place that you want to get to for the treasure. So we can consider that lies are like a bad map that lead us to the wrong place. And he uses this really cool, kind of gross picture, where he says that these people who are spreading these false teachings, it's spreading like it's gangrene, or like it's a cancer. Have you ever had that with lies in your life? That either you telling a lie or someone telling a lie about you, and it seems to just spread, and it's pretty bad, it's like gangrene, or it's like cancer that's going around you, it's not nice. So Paul warns us very strongly, avoid these lies, avoid that gangrene. And it's not just Paul, but many others write about that. Even the tiny little letter of Jude in the Bible, it speaks of people who claim to have knowledge, but they're actually being immoral and rebellious and deceiving people for money. And he says that people who are doing that, they're like dangerous reefs that can shipwreck you, or like wild waves of the sea that are churning up their foam. So it's not even just Paul who had this idea, but lots of biblical authors realize there are these dangers. False teaching, these lies, is one of them.
The second risk is pride. And pride can lead us to being unteachable. And if we're not willing to be taught, if we're not willing to learn, then we can miss out on important warnings. So we need to be humble and we need to be teachable so that we don't get shipwrecked by pride and unteachability. And the Jewish tradition that Paul and Timothy both grew up in stresses humbly giving and receiving correction. There's a lot in the wisdom literature in the scriptures about being prideful and the dangers that come from that. For example, Proverbs 29:1 says, "Whoever remains stiff-necked, not willing to bend but just being prideful and haughty, whoever remains stiff-necked after many rebukes will suddenly be destroyed without remedy." Very serious warning. So listen to one rebuke. Don't even let it take many rebukes to give you a warning. And Paul repeats this to Timothy many times in his 2 letters. In 1 Timothy 6, he says, "Anyone who teaches something different, who teaches a false gospel, is arrogant and lacks understanding. These people always cause trouble. Their minds are corrupt and they've turned their backs on the truth." And in 2 Timothy 3, he says, "Timothy, you should know this. People will love only themselves and their money. They'll be boastful and proud. They'll be puffed up with pride. They will reject the power that could make them godly." And he warns them, stay away from people like that. Stay away from proud people. And in 2 Timothy 4, he says, "Time is coming when people will no longer listen to sound and wholesome teaching. They will follow their own desires, and they will look for teachers who will tell them whatever their itching ears want to hear." Can you guys scratch your ears? Do you know what itching ears means? They wanted teachers that would tell them what their itching ears wanted to hear, that would scratch that itch. Only what they wanted to hear, not what would be actual good teaching or what would be good correction, but only what their ears wanted to hear. Someone who would tell them that what they're doing is already right, that they don't need to change. So So he says people will listen for teachers who will tell them what their itching ears want to hear, and they'll reject the truth and chase after myths. Now, I need my 4 volunteers, so I need Lucille and Anna and Rosie and Abby to come up. Oh, we're missing Lucille because she went to practice. Okay, Praveen's gonna go get her. Now, I need Anna and Lucille to come stand right here in front of the kids. And you are going to be prideful and unteachable. So let's see some stiff necks. Okay, great. Now, you're gonna plug your ears really tightly. And you're gonna close your eyes so that you can't hear the warnings. Okay? And then Rosie and Abby are going to be good students and good followers of Jesus, and they're going to keep their eyes and their ears open. You can come a little closer, girls. Ladies, young women. Okay, so you kids are gonna shout a warning to them. Maybe not shout, because we really don't want them to hear the warning. They're not listening to the warning. We don't want them to be prepared. So I'm gonna tell you what to say in just a minute, okay? Okay, now what you need to do is you need to warn Rosie and Abby that Matt and Becky have squirt guns and they should turn around. Warn them, warn them, tell them.
Look out, they have shotguns.
Okay, what's gonna happen to people who aren't looking behind them?
You guys need to run.
My go. Thank you very much for your help. Thank you for warning me, children. Good job. So we should listen to sound teaching and good warning so that we know how to avoid trouble. Now, if we should not be prideful in our own abilities or in our own knowledge, what is it okay to boast about or to be proud about? Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians. When he wrote to the Corinthians, he said, a long list of accomplishments. Like, I have everything to be proud of. I've done so many things right. I have a good religious education. I've been a faithful religious person. I've worked so hard for God, but I don't boast in any of that. He says, even all of his troubles. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Once I spent a whole night and day adrift at sea. I've traveled many long journeys. I've faced dangers from rivers and robbers, dangers from my own people. He says, and besides this, I have my daily concern for all of the churches. He says, but if I must boast, I would rather boast in the things that show how weak I am. So he says, I'll boast in my struggles because Jesus said to him, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So Paul says, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. So for Christ's sake, I delight in my weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, and in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So we don't boast in our own abilities, but we boast in the strength that Jesus gives us when we face our brokenness and our difficulties and our persecutions and our pain. So that is something that's worth boasting in.
So the first thing was, the second thing was, and the third one now is it on the screen yet? Greed. So a danger is when we're greedy. For those that were here about a month or so ago when we had the sermon on money, you heard this verse already when Paul writes to Timothy that people who want to get rich or desire to get rich fall into a trap, into many dangers. And that word want or desire, it's the same like our word in English. It can be used in good ways. There are other times where Paul says, I want this, I want this for the churches, I want this in my life. So it's not that all want and desire is bad, but he says those that are wanting or desiring to get rich, this is obviously not just I'm wanting to take care of my life, I really want to get rich. I want to have a treasure. He says those who do that, they've run after something that doesn't last, it isn't permanent, and they've pierced themselves with many graves, and they've plunged themselves towards ruin and destruction. I mean, this sounds as bad or worse than a shipwreck. Plunged into ruin and destruction. Pierced themselves with griefs. It sounds very epic, right? And Paul is willing to sort of name names here. With almost each one of these examples, Paul is telling Timothy about someone that Timothy knows and says, this is happening. And it seems like with this one, whether it was specifically money or just running for the comforts of life, was with a man named Demas. Now, Paul had various people that were his students, his proteges. Timothy wasn't the only one. And Demas was another. And Timothy and Demas knew each other. So it would be like if they had been disciples together. They had traveled around together, they had worked and studied and learned from Paul and probably had a good friendship that way. But then Paul, when he's writing to Timothy, has to give him this bad news that, Timothy, my student and your friend Demas has run away from me because he loved the world, the stuff of the world. So Timothy's reading this for the first time, that someone else has left because they wanted the stuff that the world can give. And that's not solely money by any means, but that can be one of those pictures. Well, he says these things aren't lasting, they're fleeting. So we have a nice treasure chest. Do you want some of the treasure? Yeah? Who wants some treasure? Yeah? Okay. Let's see what we have in our treasure chest today. So, ooh, this is my favorite. We have food. You want some of the food now?
No thanks.
You haven't even seen it yet. It's not up close. See, there are some things that you get when you make it, but then there's some things that God just adds on afterward that gives that little extra flavor. You know? The green stuff. Do you want this treasure? No.
Yeah, that's the treasure of the world, not the treasure of God.
So that's the danger with so much of our wealth. That's the danger with our money is maybe it's nice for a time, maybe it is helpful, but it's gonna decay, it's gonna mold, it's gonna go away. And just because it comes in a nice box doesn't mean that what it's gonna lead to in your life will be its fairy tale ending like you're wanting. So he says, we have to be careful of that. John also writes about that. He says, don't love the world or anything in the world. Those that love the world and choose that over God have run away from God. So our treasures shouldn't be found in this world. Because those treasures are the things that will just die and go away. Or mold and become all gross.
Does this one end? Yes, it does. Keep going this way.
The fourth risk is bad character. And bad character, especially among ministry leaders, can not only shipwreck their own faith, but can shipwreck the faith of a lot of other people. So good character is really important for all of us to avoid shipwrecking our faith and the faith of others. Paul warns about recent converts getting too much power so they could get conceited. It's giving them too much too soon. And he warns that elders should have good reputations, so it's not too little too late. In 1 Timothy 3, he warns that a church leader should not be a new believer because they might become proud and the devil would cause them to fall. And people outside the church must speak well of them so they will not be disgraced and fall into the devil's trap. He says that church leaders need to be above reproach. And it was important in the Greek culture in Ephesus that civic leaders be people of good character. So because church leaders were becoming known, it was important to Paul that the leaders of the churches, the house churches in Ephesus, should have good character as well. Because Christianity was still a minority movement at the time and could easily have been crushed by the Roman Empire. This was already happening in Rome. Christians were being persecuted. So Paul wanted the Christians to have a good reputation in the city so that it would bring honor to the church and not persecution on the church or condemnation on the church. Basically, so they wouldn't make God look bad. And he says that leaders need to be tested first before they gain more responsibility. And the church in Ephesus had been there for over a decade, so there was time for leaders to be tested and to be proven and to be put into leadership. And Paul does this with Timothy. Timothy wasn't a new believer. He had been raised as a follower of Jesus by his faithful mother and grandmother. And then Paul had taken him on as a mentee. And Paul didn't make Timothy a ministry leader in his teens when he first started learning, but he didn't prevent him from doing ministry either. He gave him responsibility alongside Paul. So Paul took him with him on his journeys and gave him hands-on mentoring and taught him and trained him and gave him more freedom until eventually he was able to put Timothy in Ephesus, leading the churches, being an overseer, while Paul was far away in Rome because he had trained Timothy. And Timothy was still young at that point. A lot of civil organizations at the time would have only put people in leadership when they were above 30 and probably even 40. And when Timothy was leading churches in Ephesus, he might have still been as young as in his 20s or 30s. And Paul tells him, don't let people look down on you because you're young. Because Paul knew that Timothy had a good reputation, and even though he was young, he was trained, he had a good reputation, and he was well prepared and tested. So what happens when we have leaders who lead us into doing bad things? What do you think, Joshua? What do we do when leaders lead us into doing bad things? Sometimes we follow a bad example. So we're going to play a little game of follow the leader for anybody. Okay, thank you so much. You can go sit down. So we want to make sure that we're following good examples and that we're setting good examples for people in the church. So what does good character look like in the churches for the women and men who became the overseers, the elders, the deacons, and the teachers in the church? They should be self-controlled and hospitable, able to teach. They should be not violent but gentle. They should be not quarrelsome, not a lover of money, not a recent convert. That they should have a good reputation with outsiders. They should not be overbearing, so they shouldn't use their power to try to control other people. They should not be quick-tempered. They should be peaceable and not quick to argue. They should love what is good. They should hold to the truth. They should be tried and tested, and they should be respectable. And that's important for us in our churches today as well. We want people who are calm and peaceable and good teachers and who set a good example for everyone to follow. And Timothy was someone who did this. And so Paul knew that he could trust him with the churches.
So thing number one was?
Rise.
Thing number two?
Rise.
That might be, I don't know. Thing number three? Thing number four? Oh, I'm doing great. Thing number five? Fear. Now that can shipwreck your faith. That can lead you off course. As Paul wrote to Timothy, especially in 2 Timothy, we find Paul he's older and he's becoming a little more lonely. Especially as he writes, he's writing of that loneliness because he's feeling that he has a dwindling number of friends. During his imprisonment and during his persecution, we already saw that Demas ran off, but he even writes to Timothy, everyone from the province of Asia has deserted me. If you felt deserted by everyone in a whole province, he mentions even Phygelus and Hermogenes. So again, he's willing to mention names. And he says that his first hearing, no one came with me, everyone abandoned me. So Paul was feeling like more and more people were running away. And that was something that obviously Paul was concerned about. Because it wasn't just running away from him, but it was often them running away from the calling that the Holy Spirit had given all of them. But Paul wrote to Timothy that Timothy knew how much persecution and suffering that he had endured. Becky earlier read something from 2 Corinthians, which Timothy co-wrote with Paul, so Timothy totally knew what was going on. When Paul writes about just some of those things, like being stoned once, which happened in Timothy's hometown, or being whipped 5 times, being beaten with rods, the shipwrecks, day and night adrift on the sea, that he was in danger in cities, and in danger in countries, in danger on rivers, and in danger on seas, in danger from his own country people, endangered from people from other countries, endangered from robbers. And he's willing to even compare himself with some of these false teachers and say, compared to them, I worked harder, I went with too little sleep, I went with too little food, I went with too little clothing to keep me warm. Paul had faced a lot of persecution, and so Timothy knew that he wasn't going to get any sympathy points. Paul, I don't know if you've ever been one of those where like you're feeling bad for yourself and then you hear about someone else with something that's worse going on. The most memorable or easiest one for me has for a long time been the time I was at work and I was going to get home and I went to find my bike. I had a flat tire in it, so I had to walk all the way home with my bike because it wasn't going to work. And I was really looking forward to when my wife would get home and feel really bad for me and hopefully give me a back rub. Well, my wife was late getting home. I was like, what's going on? And then when she called me, she said, I'm sorry. It's taking me a while because my bike was stolen. Oh my God. And in that moment, I felt bad for her because it had been her bike that she'd had for years. But I also felt bad for me because I knew, like, there's no sympathy points for, like, flat tire, so no. That's not. So Timothy knew, try not to get sympathy points from Paul because he knew the long list of what Paul had. But Paul had remained faithful. And Paul seems to have this, how could other people run away? How could they not have known when they first came to this faith in the first place? Paul says that everyone who wants to live a godly life will be persecuted. He said we knew that from the beginning. And it wasn't just Paul, but this is all over the writings from these early leaders in the New Testament. Going back to the beginning of the whole new covenant idea with Jesus. Because Jesus told his disciples, do you remember what I told you? A slave is not greater than the master. Well, since they persecuted me, naturally they're going to persecute you. Peter wrote the same thing. Well, since Christ suffered, be ready to suffer too. Don't be surprised at the fiery trials you're going through as if something strange were happening to you. It's no shame to suffer for being a Christian. The brother of Jesus, James, wrote that when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. John, who was one of Jesus' disciples, later when he wrote Revelation, said, God's holy people must endure persecution patiently, obeying his commands, maintaining their faith in Jesus. And Jesus speaks in the book of Revelation and says, don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. The writer of the book of Hebrews wrote, remember how you remained faithful even when you faced terrible suffering? Remember how you were thrown into jail, you were exposed to public ridicule, you were beaten, all you owned was taken from you, and yet you accepted that with joy. You knew there were better things that waited for you, so continue in God's will. Because there are better things that will last forever, unlike the treasure of the earth that will fade away. And so we're not like those who turn away from God to their own destruction, but we're those that hold faithful and are saved. And so the writer of Hebrews, connected with some of the other things that Paul wrote, we see running away. It's dangerous to our faith because it takes us off course and it can even lead to destruction. If we're afraid of persecution and run away from it. Instead, we should know that we will face struggles. So Paul uses his sufferings to contrast that with those false teachers that he calls evil people and imposters. So if you've never been told that so-called Christianity that will sometimes be like, oh, well, your life is going to be easy, and life is going to be good, and if you just follow Jesus, nothing bad is going to happen to you. If you've never been told, that's a lie, because we're told by Jesus and James and Peter and John and Paul and Hebrews and the writers, Matthew, and every gospel writer, we're told by all of them to not be surprised, not to be afraid or ashamed that persecution can come our way. So don't jump ship when it looks like there's these stormy trials coming at you. Which remind us, hopefully, a little bit of Paul's story from earlier in his shipwreck. When the sailors are like, oh no, we're going to wreck. Let's jump out of the boat. Let's jump out of the boat. We're not supposed to jump out of the boat, but stay in our faith despite that persecution. So, showing how people sometimes jump ship, we have created a makeshift plank for children to get to walk if they'd like to. Did you have further instructions on how that was going to work?
we're gonna do one at a time, but if anyone wants to walk the plank and then jump ship to show what not to do, you can. I'll stand next to it if you want a hand to hold. But let's make a line and then walk that way.
Now, as we think about this idea of persecution and not running away from it, an important thing is that this would also connect with Timothy. Not just that Timothy knew about Paul's sufferings, but that Timothy knew about many of the persecutions these churches were facing. As Becky said, Paul started giving Timothy responsibilities for a while. And we're told of a few times where he's together with some other people, but what's perhaps his first solo mission that Paul sends him on is to go to the city of Thessalonica. Now, I don't know if you've ever been around people who are doing their first job before. I get a feeling like that happened to me, I think it was on Tuesday. I went to the grocery store, and there was this young man dressed in the grocery store's outfit, and an older lady walks him out to the casa, the conveyor belt, and she's telling him like, okay, so you're gonna sit here and then push on the buttons, and then you just stay here, and people are gonna come, and you'll do your work, bye, and then she just walks off. And I had that feeling, like I get to be the second person in line, and it seemed to me like this is probably his first time doing it by himself. Do you ever had that nervousness of like, oh, yeah, you've been watching someone else do it, you've been trained in it, they're standing there, but now they're not standing there, and it's just you doing it by yourself? Was that kind of a memorable moment if you've ever had that? The guy actually did great. I wanted to be like, yeah, thank you, you did such a wonderful job. Beep, 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 beeping my groceries. He did a good job. You could feel that nervousness. Well, that's sort of what Timothy had when it seems the first time Paul sends Timothy away, and they write in a letter to the Thessalonians, which Timothy co-wrote as well. He says, when I couldn't stand it any longer, I sent Timothy to you to make sure that your faith hadn't failed. Because you remember when we were with you, we told you that we would face trials and temptations, and you know that all that actually has come upon you as well. But I hope that you wouldn't be shaken by those troubles. So even while we were with you, we warned you, but I was afraid that the tempter had gotten the best of you and that our work had been useless. So I sent Timothy. So Timothy would probably remember that moment of being sent off. Paul saying, hey, I want you to go to Thessalonica. They have been facing persecution. You may very well on the way, but go make sure their faith hasn't failed. So this, I think especially, would be a memorable thing for Timothy. Don't be afraid. Risk number 6.
Risk number 6 is loose lips, because loose lips sink ships. This was a war slogan in America during World War. And loose lips sink ships means that if you're not careful about what you say, you might give away important information to spies, and it could end up resulting in your ship being sunk. But it also has become an American idiom, which means that you don't want to be careless with your words because bad things could happen. Other cultures have similar sayings. The British equivalent was careless talk costs lives, and the German translated into English is shame on you, blabbermouth. Sounds very German.
Can anyone say that in German? What's that no one saying?
In German, it's Scham dich Schwarzer. My German pronunciation is not very, is that right? It was mediocre? So we want to be careful with our words because loose lips do sink the ship of faith. And there are several different types of speech that can really destroy our faith and that of others. The first is arguments. Paul encourages Timothy to avoid arguments. In 2 Timothy 2, he says, command people in God's presence to stop fighting over words. Such arguments are useless and they can ruin those who hear them. So there is a place for theological discussion and wrangling and figuring out what we believe and how we work together, but just foolish arguments can really be destructive. So watch our words and be careful with them. We should also watch out for gossip and slander and rumors. We don't want to be malicious talkers. In 1 Timothy, in chapters 3 and 5, Paul is talking about a group of widows who seemed to be the targets of some false teachers. And he warns them not to be malicious talkers. And women in the culture were less educated than men, and so they were assumed to be easy targets for false teachers. And especially widows who owned their own homes would be a great target. If you were trying to target a place where you could start a false congregation, a widow with a house is a great way to begin. So these widows were being targeted by false teachers. Paul was warning them not to listen to false teaching and not to give into gossip and slander and rumors. So both of those, the gossip and the false teaching, Paul warns Timothy to watch for, especially in this congregation of widows. Now, Paul's solution for that, to keep women from spreading old wives' tales or false teaching, Paul's solution in 1 Timothy 2 is let them learn. And he talks about people being silent as they learn in a position of respect and honor so that they would learn. And Paul was very countercultural in saying, let the women learn so that they can teach. And the perfect example he could point to was his friend Priscilla, who was a well-known church leader and teacher in Ephesus. So learn humbly, and then you can teach, and you won't pass on false teaching, but you can be like my friend Priscilla. So we want to watch out for our words to make sure that we are not arguing, that we're not gossiping or slandering people, and that we're not passing on false teaching. We don't want to be busybodies who talk nonsense. And Paul's not the only one who talks about our tongues doing damage. James also writes quite a lot about that. James says, those who consider themselves religious, yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues, deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Their tongues drive our bodies. And in James 3, he wrote, not many of you should become teachers, because we who teach will be judged more strictly. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. And James uses ships as an example. He says, take ships. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. The tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue is a fire, he says. With our tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's image. Out of the same mouth comes praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. So he says we want to use our words not to destroy people, not to steer a ship off course and shipwreck our faith, not to start a forest fire, but to build people up. So we're going to use wind as an example of how we can use our tongues. If the wind blows really strongly, kids, it could blow the ship off course, right? That's what we looked at. It can cause waves, or it can blow the ship over, blow it off course. But it also can be gentle. Can you blow gently? Our tongues can be gentle, just like a gentle wind is refreshing. So I have some feathers and some straws, and you're going to try to blow a feather with a straw very gently to remind you to use your tongue to speak gentle, loving words, not cruel, harsh, destructive words. So this is an example of the good kind of words that we should use. Gentle words, careful words with our tongues, not a destructive wind that will shipwreck a faith, but gentle words that will build people up and keep them afloat. So Paul gives some advice on how we should speak instead of these negative things. In his letter to the Ephesian Christians a few years before, which is where Timothy still is, he says, we should no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves, blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and by the cunning and craftiness of people and their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become, in every respect, the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. So don't be tossed by the waves, don't buy into false teaching, but use your words to speak truth in love. He says, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up, according to their needs, so that it may benefit those who listen. And in Titus, he says, don't slander anyone, be peaceable and considerate, and always be gentle toward anyone. So those are some ways that we can use our tongues to speak good words instead of having loose lips that sink ships.
So you remember all 6 of those? Yeah, I just started beginning. So first one? Lies. Second one? Third one? Fourth one? Fifth one? Sixth one. Who's this? So those 6 things can be risks, and those honestly aren't the only ones. So, your Timothy task for this week. Each week we've been trying to give people something practical that they can do to put some of this into use. So, we have cut out a bunch of waves and sandbars that you will be able to take with you. That's sandpaper, so it's our sandbar, and a wave. You can choose which one you want, and these I think we'll pass around if you have a pen or something like that. And on that paper, this can be just for yourself, you don't have to share it, you don't have to give it to your friends or anything. But write down something that might shipwreck your faith that you know. That could be one of those 6 things that as you heard that, you went, yeah, that's me. I have to be careful of greed. I have to be careful of pride. I have to be careful of how I use my words. But that can also be something else that isn't specifically mentioned by Paul in these letters to Timothy. But think about that. What's something that you know could be a danger for you? And use that practical thing to have so that you can pray about that this week. And be asking God to give you protection, to maybe you do want to then talk to some friends about it and say, hey, this is something that can be a danger for me. Would you help steer me in the right way? Or do you know any good Bible verses for me? Or any of those sorts of things. So take one of these, write something down, and use that to be a warning to yourself. Again, this isn't a fear tactic to make people afraid that, every day is going to be horrible for them. But it is good for us to remember that these are true good warnings by the Holy Spirit and by the biblical authors that we don't want to wreck our faith. We know that Jesus is going to be with us in the storms, and we have a dance group today that's going to do one last dance before we're done.
When the solid ground is falling out from underneath my feet, between the black skies and my red eyes, I can barely see. And when I'm feeling like I've been let down by my friends and my family, I can hear the rain behind me. In the eye of the storm, you remain in control. In the middle of the war, you guard my soul. You alone are the anchor when my sails are torn. Your love surrounds me in the eye of the storm. When my hopes and dreams are far from me and I'm running out of faith, I see the future I picture slowly fade away. And when the tears of pain and heartache are pouring down my face, I find my peace in Jesus' name. In the eye of the storm, you remain in control. In the middle of the war, you guard my soul. You alone are the anchor when my sails are torn. Your love surrounds me in the eye of the storm. When they let me go, and I just don't know how I'm gonna make ends meet. I did my best, now I'm scared to death that we might lose everything. And when I sickness takes my child away, then there's nothing I can do. My only hope is to trust you. I trust you, Lord, in the eye of the storm. You remain in control. In the middle of the war, you guard my soul. You alone are the anchor in the eye of the storm.